हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज की वीडियो में हम बात करेंगे टी.एस. एलियट की पोम जर्नी ऑफ द मेजाई के बारे में। पोएट के बारे में हम पहले एक वीडियो में डिस्कस कर चुके हैं, जिसका लिंक डिस्क्रिप्शन में है। पोम को इन डेप्थ जानने से पहले जान लेते हैं उसके कुछ की फीचर्स। जर्नी ऑफ मेजाई shows the transformative and spiritual journey of Magi as he sees a new spiritual reality. The main message of the poem is spiritual transformation comes with challenges and emotional turmoil. The speaker of the poem is, I think, the poet himself, who presents himself as a biblical Magi. The poem is written as a dramatic monologue and it does not follow any particular rhyme scheme, that is, it is written in free verse. The poet tries to evoke the emotions of contentment, empathy, faith, hope, regret. The poem is a great example of a modern piece of writing. The poem is divided into 3 stanzas of unequal length. The first stanza contains 20 lines, the second stanza has 11 lines, and the third stanza has 12 lines. There are many lines in the poem where the end words or phrases are repeated. This creates a sense of unity in the poem, which is only emphasized by the speaker's direct storytelling. It describes about the terrible conditions through which the Magi traversed to meet the Christ child after his birth. It tells us about his difficulties, his challenges, and how he finally meets the Christ child. Stanza 1. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year. What a journey! And such a long journey. The way deep and the weather sharp. The very dead of winter. And the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling, and running away, and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty, and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel at night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. In the first stanza of the poem, the speaker, who is one of the traveling Magi, starts the poem by giving a broad overview of the journey he and other Magi embarked on. It was not a pleasant trip. They had a cold morning of it. The men were forced to deal with terrible weather that made everything harder. The speaker reflects on the days of travel as having occurred in the worst time of the year for a journey, due to the fact that they could not choose when they traveled, they had to face these conditions. Then the next lines expand the details of their journey and the troubles they had to face along the way. The men were not only ones who suffered at this time. Their camels, which were made to walk through the landscape bearing men, and their supplies were galled, sore-footed, refractory. They eventually ended up lying down in the melting snow. It is interesting that the poet chose to begin this piece, which is about the birth of Christ, in such a way. It does away with the image of majestic beings riding in to visit the child. Instead, they are painted as deeply human. They suffer just as anyone would traversing the countryside. The speaker even states at one point that there were times we regretted or missed the summer palaces, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. They were all elements of their home, which were familiar to them, and without which they were made to travel. The following lines, which are crafted in an ever worsening list, describe a litany of problems the men faced. They were the camel men who were often cursing and grumbling. At points, they even ran away from the camps, seeing out liquor and women. The campsites were often cold as the fires went out, and there were no shelters to keep the men and animals dry. In addition to these troubles with nature, they faced hostile cities and unfriendly towns that were unwilling to help them. The men had a hard time of it. By the time they got to the end of the journey, they had learned to prefer traveling at night. This way, they could avoid the worst that the landscape and the cities it held had to offer. There were even times on the way to meet the Son of God that they said this was all folly. Stanza 2. Then at dawn we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snowline, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, and so we continued, and arriving at evening not a moment too soon. Finding the place, it was, you might say, satisfactory. In the second stanza, a few changes come over the party of travelers. The speaker describes a dawn in which they came down to a temperate valley. This is a landscape that is quite unfamiliar to them, as they had spent so much time traveling through such terrible conditions. The valley is below the snow line and it smells of vegetation. It is clear from these first lines that they have come to a much better place. There is running water and a watermill beating in the dark. Eventually, the men make their way to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel. They inquired at this tavern, looking for information about Christ, and they received none. The men continued to travel and arrive at evening. It was, the speaker states, not a moment too soon. Everyone was close to their final breaking point, having faced hunger, terribly cold weather, shelterless nights, and inhospitable towns. One might expect the speaker to revel in his arrival to the manager where Christ was born. This is not the case. He says that the pace they finally came to was satisfactory, nothing more. This could be a reference more to a physicality of a place rather than the momentous nature of the occasion, but either way, it is a strikingly drab and depressing way to describe the moment. Stanza 3. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but sat down. This sat down, this were we led all that way for. Birth or death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence, and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here. In the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods, I should be glad to of another death. In the third stanza, the speaker halts his description of the journey and moves on to describe how he feels about the entire experience now. It is clear he has terrible memories of the trip, but what of the manager itself? He begins by saying it was a long time ago, but he would do it again. It was at least in his mind a journey worth undertaking. It is at this point in the poem the speaker directs a question to his listener, to whom he is telling the story. He asks, were we led all that way for birth or death? He knows that there certainly was a birth. This is the case, as there was evidence and no doubt. But what of the death? In the next line, he equates birth and death. This particular birth was so painful to the Magi and their companions that it was like death, our death. After the trip was over, they turned to their places These kingdoms, when they arrived there and attempted to settle back into the lives they once knew and loved, they were no longer at ease. Everything had changed for them. The men did not feel comfortable in this world in which alien people clutching their gods were they had seen the true world. The poem concludes with the speaker stating that he would be glad to die another death. Perhaps this one could bring him to his final rest alongside God. Poetic devices, alliteration, the repetition of the same initial consonant sound in nearby words such as cold coming and camel men cursing. Sibilance, the repetition of S sounds such as in summer palaces on slopes and silken girls bringing sherbet. Simile, for example, hard and bitter agony for us like death, our death. Irony, for example, I should be glad for another death. Objective correlative, a combination of images and objects that evokes a specific emotion. For example, the image of three trees along the low key implies the crucifixion of Christ. Polysyncreton, the use of multiple conjunction to overwhelm the reader with a series of ideas. For example, running away and the night fires going out and the city is hostile and the towns unfriendly and the villages dirty. Themes, suffering. Much of the poem is a complaint about the suffering experienced by the Magi on the journey to reach Bethlehem. They endured terrible weather, uncooperative camels and camelmen, and hostile townspeople. They also suffer mentally and emotionally as they realize the imminent death of their way of life. The suffering of Jesus is also foreshadowed in the many biblical allusions in the third stanza. The poem overall is dour and anticlimactic and suggests that religious conversion is a difficult process. Doubt. In the first stanza, the Magi struggle with doubting their religious faith. They experience mental anguish as they hear the voices of others questioning their decision, with the voices singing in our ears saying that this was all folly. In the final stanza, the Magus doubt the purpose of their journey. He thought that they were going to witness a birth, but what they ultimately saw was a death of both Jesus and in his own way of life as a pagan. He says that rationally they had evidence of a birth, but the emotional feeling was of the opposite. So he struggles with the paradox of at the heart of the experience. Death. For the Magi, the birth of Jesus Christ heralds not only his impending death by crucifixions for the sins of humanity, but also the death of their own pagan way of life, their traditions, and the power. The poem contains many allusions to the life and death of Christ in the New Testament. For example, the three trees on the low sky represents the crucifixion. थैंक यू। आई होप आज की वीडियो आपको अच्छी लगी होगी। अगर अच्छी लगी तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माय चैनल एंड हमें कमेंट करके बताइए कि आप नेक्स्ट वीडियो किस टॉपिक पर देखना चाहते हैं। मिलते हैं कल एक और इन्फॉर्मेटिव वीडियो के साथ शाम 4 बजे।